Okay, here's another way of thinking about how we might analyse and answer a question to do with the democratic legitimacy of the European Union and its law-making processes. Another way, we sketched one framework in the previous video. Another way of looking at this is to think about different aspects of political legitimacy and democracy. So for some scholars, like for instance Joseph Weiler or Jürgen Habermas or Andreas Follisdal and Simon Hicks, what matters here is input legitimacy. What are the processes by which it is decided who makes decisions on law or policy? Now, in the case of input legitimacy, the lack of a genuine European Union level contestation for political leadership or for overall policy direction to be determined by a majority of the European Union electorate means that the European Union cannot meet even the most basic standards for representative democracy. In terms of an input legitimacy model, there is no way for the electorate to hold decision makers in the EU to account by not electing them the next time. The structures of the EU preclude that type of input legitimacy. For other scholars, like for example Andrew Moravcsik, what matters more is process or procedural legitimacy. The checks and the balances on the institutions which make law, to secure that law-making process from corruption, from arbitrary decisions, or from misuse of power. When we're thinking about process or procedural legitimacy, both legal and political accountability processes are important. And of course, the most important legal process of accountability is judicial review. We'll come to judicial review in the European Union context in much more detail in the future. Just note it for now. For a third group of scholars, like Anand Menon and Stephen Wetherill, what matters is output legitimacy. How do we secure public approval of the substantive outcome of the EU's decision-making processes? What matters in this framework is not how the decision makers are elected or what precise power each EU institution has. For instance, is the European Commission President elected? To what extent can the European Parliament control the European Commission? To what extent can the Council adopt law that the European Parliament doesn't support? Those things don't matter so much in the context of output legitimacy. What matters is how effective EU law is. And here we need to think back to what Steve Wetherill argues is the point and purpose of the EU, to manage interdependencies between states and to use law to make sure that those interdependencies are managed well. Taking into account the interdependence of the member states, we can argue that the EU is actually more democratic than not being in the EU, because the EU is able to represent interests that have little or no voice in national context. For example, citizens of other countries who are resident within an EU member state. Now, a final group of scholars, like Kalypso Nikolaidis, have taken this a step further and argue that the form and nature of the European Union and its relationships with its component member states and their peoples, note, not citizens, not people, their peoples, mean that we need to reconceptualize democracy altogether. And if we think back to Article 10 TEU, Article 10 TEU hints at this reconceptualization because it talks about the citizens being directly represented by the European Parliament, but the member states being represented through council. So Nikolaidis argues for a new notion of democracy, which she calls demoicracy. the word demoi coming from the word demos, meaning more than one demos. And demoicracy is a new term which escapes from the duality of the notion that a demos, a people, can be either only national or European. The European Union is neither, or perhaps is partly both, a state in the making, becoming a European superstate, nor is it a mere collaboration of independent democratic nation states. And in Nicolaides' notion of democracy, the EU is not an end state like a nation state is an end state. The EU is an unfolding process. So this analytical frame also relates to the temporal frame that we talked about in the previous video. Let's listen to Paul Craig in 2019 on the subject. So this is in the Craig and de Burke textbook, which is available via Law Trove. It's on page 197. And Paul Craig is reflecting on the EU, democracy and its institutional structures. And he talks about a paradox. There is a paradox, says Paul, at the heart of the EU. It's a paradox of cause and effect in the EU's interinstitutional configuration of power as it presently exists and as it's likely to continue to exist into the future. The cause captures these facts, says Paul Craig. The member states have shaped the way that the EU is presently configured. That shape, that configuration of EU interinstitutional power is beset by a democratic deficit, insofar as there is scant connection between electoral vote and political power or responsibility, such that it is difficult for the voters to express a view as to the direction of EU policy that will be translated into action. The member states bear the principal responsibility for the status quo because they devised the current scheme. So Paul Craig is saying here that the cause of the EU's democratic deficit is because of the way that the member states have chosen to construct the EU. So if there is a problem with the EU, that problem, if there's a democratic problem with the structure of the EU, that problem lies with the member states, not with the EU itself. Paul goes on to talk about the effect. The effect captures the way in which we think about democratic legitimation in the EU. The infirmities in EU decision-making constitute the driver for the argument that EU legitimacy and democracy must be grounded in the member states, not merely as one mode of representation within the EU. The argument becomes more visceral and foundational, says Paul, in the sense that it is the member states and the national parliaments in the member states that are regarded as the bedrock of democracy. Their claims in this regard are grounded in the EU's democratic deficiencies. And this in turn is used to fuel the argument that such parliaments should participate in EU decision-making. The paradox, goes on Paul, lies in the conjunction of cause and effect. Member state choice is central to the way that the EU is structured and to the democratic infirmity that is reflected in that structure. The infirmity cannot by definition be resolved at EU level, given the nature of the choice thus made, with the consequence that the solution has to be found somewhere else. The paradox is exacerbated by reason of the fact that most national parliaments would actually be in accord with their governments in resisting change that would alleviate the very democratic deficit that they criticise, because of the effect that that would have on their own power, on the power of national parliaments. So While a true political union would involve not suppressing but channeling and providing meaningful conflict over the EU's substantive goals, so a real political discussion about what kinds of laws the EU should be adopting in a range of different areas, there is scant likelihood that that will ever happen. The EU, says Paul, is caught between a rock and a hard place. It's berated in equal measure for its over-attachment to the economic at the expense of the social, while it is castigated for lacking democratic legitimacy to make dispositive social or redistributive decisions. So from the point of view of the democracy framework for analysis, the European Union can never be democratic in the traditional sense of democracy. The very way that the European Union is designed precludes that being a reality at any point. Now, you've listened a lot already. Actually, I just want to go back for a second and just summarise slightly what Paul Craig said. Just bear with me. So the EU is caught between a rock and a hard place. The EU cannot win at the game of becoming democratic. Remember Article 10 of the Treaty on European Union. And the Treaty on European Union, remember, is an agreement between the member states that the EU in its current formation shall be founded on representative democracy. The provisions of the treaties that set out the roles and powers of the EU institutions are agreed to be in that way by the member states, by the governments of the member states. The treaties are as close to a constitution as the EU has, and yet, fundamentally, they are not a constitution. Okay, you've listened a lot and looked at the videos. Now it's time to do something a bit more active to consolidate your learning. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to watch a YouTube video. It was made in 2017, and there's 5 minutes of the video with voice and infographics. And while you're watching this video, and you might want to watch it more than once, there are 3 things that I would like you to do. And of course, as you know, doing something rather than just passively watching will enhance your learning. It'll also mean you've got some notes down towards the eventual assessment and your upcoming workshops, as well as the electronic workbook, which you'll be working on this week and next. While you watch, as I said, I want you to do 3 things. Spot the aspect of this recording, which was made in 2017, that is now incorrect. The first time you watch this through, secondly, I'd like you to make notes, perhaps in 4 columns, as to which aspects of the lawmaking process described can be described as input, democracy or legitimacy, which as process legitimacy or democracy, which as output legitimacy or democracy, and which are aspects of democracy, or the paradox of the EU's institutional structure. The second time you watch it through, pause it at each moment to be able to take a note of the relevant provision of the treaty that sets out the legal position that's being described. You might want to wait to do this until after you've done the relevant parts of the electronic workbook. I've done the first one for you on the slide as an example. The right to propose a new law, the right of initiative, officially lies solely with the European Commission, and the legal provision in which that rule about the EU's lawmaking powers is found is Article 17, subparagraph 2 of the Treaty on European Union. If you want to make your notes more sophisticated, add in also where there are exceptions to the rules being outlined. Use the Craig and de Burke textbook, or Barnard and Peers, or Chalmers to help you. Once you've done all that, well done. This week on your agenda is also the electronic workbook, which you can reach from Blackboard. Don't fall behind on this, because you will need to have finished it in time for your face-to-face tutorial. Your face-to-face tutorial will be just you and 4 other students with one of us. And if you've done all of that, for revision or consolidation, you could try Marcus Cleaver on YouTube on the European Union's democratic deficit. It's 17 minutes worth of a video. Notice that Marcus's conceptual framework is quite simple compared to the frameworks that we're looking at in our module. But Marcus does make links across lots of other topics that we will cover in the module. So this is also an extension activity, not just a consolidation or revision activity. Finally, just to remind you, don't struggle with this on your own. We're here. We're virtually here, but nonetheless here for you. We want you to do well in this module, so don't hesitate to use one or more of these means of reaching us. On social media, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Tamara Harvey, or I'm Tammy Harvey on Facebook. My email address is t.hervey@sheffield.ac.uk. And good luck with getting on with the work.